The Caltherian war fleet had arrived at Dawn's Edge Academy with a singular purpose: total annihilation. Their crimson ships hung in orbit like bleeding wounds against the black canvas of space, weapons charged and ready. The Academy, a prestigious institution where dozens of species sent their brightest young minds, had been marked for destruction. Not for any strategic value, but as a message, a demonstration of Caltherian dominance that would echo across the galaxy. Commander Veshkan stood on the bridge of the flagship, his 4 eyes gleaming with satisfaction as tactical displays showed the Academy's pitiful defenses. A handful of outdated turrets, 2 ancient shield generators, no military fleet within 3 days' travel. The Academy staff had already transmitted their surrender, begging for mercy, offering no resistance. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. "Destroy the communications array first," Veshkan ordered, his mandibles clicking with pleasure. "Let them watch helplessly as we descend. Then we will take our time with the rest." The first bombardment struck the northern wing, sending a plume of fire and debris into the thin atmosphere. Alarms shrieked through the Academy's corridors. Students from 100 worlds scrambled in panic. Teachers tried desperately to maintain order, and the small security force knew with grim certainty that they were about to die. In the chaos, nobody noticed the solitary figure in Maintenance Section 7. Nobody paid attention to the human janitor who had been quietly mopping floors and repairing ventilation systems for the past 3 years. His name was Marcus Webb, though most just called him the Human, if they addressed him at all. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, not particularly remarkable except for their strange durability and their tendency to bond with practically anything. Marcus had kept his head down since arriving at the Academy. He did his job, stayed out of politics, and spent his free time in the small quarters he'd made surprisingly comfortable. The other staff knew little about him except that he'd served in Earth's military before taking this position, seeking something quieter after what he vaguely referred to as bad years. But Marcus had also done something that seemed insignificant at the time. He had befriended a child. Her name was Zilara, a young Plenari girl whose species resembled what humans might describe as a cross between a deer and a songbird. She was 7 years old by Plenari standards, shy and often overlooked by the other students, because Plenari were considered weak, their civilization one of artists and philosophers rather than warriors or scientists. Zilara's parents had scraped together everything they had to send her to Dawn's Edge, hoping education might give her opportunities their poor world could not. She had been crying in a storage closet one day, 6 months ago, when Marcus found her. Some older students had mocked her for her appearance, her accent, her species' reputation. Marcus had sat down beside her, offered her a handkerchief, and told her a story about a dog he'd had as a child, a 3-legged rescue that everyone said was worthless, but became his best friend for 15 years. After that, Zilara would sometimes seek Marcus out. She'd sit with him during his lunch breaks, practicing her English while he learned a few words of Plenari. He'd show her pictures of Earth on his datapad, the oceans and mountains that amazed her. She'd share her drawings, elaborate scenes of imaginary worlds rendered in surprising detail. To Marcus, she was a good kid in a universe that wasn't always kind to good kids. To Zilara, he was the one adult who seemed to actually see her. When the Caltherian bombardment began, Zilara had been in the eastern dormitory with her class. The explosion that tore through the northern wing sent shock waves that shattered windows throughout the complex. The children screamed. Their teacher, an elderly Voxian named Prel, tried to keep them calm, but his voice trembled with fear he couldn't hide. Then the Caltherian dropships descended, cutting through the smoke-filled sky like descending angels of death. Their doors opened before they even touched ground, and soldiers poured out, weapons ready, expressions eager. The Caltherians were a predator species, scaled and powerful, and they had been bred for war across 1,000 generations. They moved through the Academy's corridors with practiced efficiency, killing any adults they encountered and herding children toward the central plaza. Veshkan had specific orders for the young ones. They would be taken, their fates used as leverage against their homeworlds. Some would be ransomed. Others would disappear into the slave markets that officially didn't exist, but flourished in the darker corners of the galaxy. The Caltherians prided themselves on their efficiency. Zilara clutched her sketchpad to her chest as soldiers burst into her dormitory. She watched in horror as Prel moved to protect his students and was struck down with casual brutality. The children were grabbed, dragged, thrown together. One of Zilara's classmates, a young Hixian boy, was crying for his mother. The Caltherians laughed. They were being forced down the corridor when Zilara saw him. Marcus, emerging from a maintenance access tunnel, covered in dust and soot. Their eyes met. For just a moment, she saw something in his expression that made her freeze. It wasn't fear. It wasn't despair. It was something cold and calculating. A look that didn't belong on the face of a friendly janitor who told stories and shared his lunch. "Marcus!" she screamed, the word torn from her throat, before a Caltherian soldier struck her across the face, sending her sprawling. That scream, that single moment of a child calling for help, changed everything. Marcus had been moving through the maintenance tunnels, assessing the situation, planning his escape route. He'd survived worse than this. The Academy had emergency protocols, hidden evacuation passages that most staff didn't know about, but that he'd memorized within his first week. He could make it to the small craft bay, steal a shuttle, be gone before the Caltherians even knew he existed. Survival. That was the smart play. That was what 3 tours in humanity's nastiest conflicts had taught him. But then Zilara screamed his name. Then he saw a soldier hit her. Something shifted behind Marcus's eyes. Something that had been carefully locked away for 3 years, that he'd come to this distant academy specifically to escape, came howling back to the surface. The other staff members didn't know his full history because he'd never told them. They didn't know that Marcus Webb had once been Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Webb, call sign Badger, who'd earned that nickname not for his appearance, but for his absolute refusal to stop once engaged. They didn't know about the 18 decorations sitting in a box under his bed, or the classified after-action reports that made senior officers uncomfortable, or the psychological evaluation that had used the phrase controlled fury 7 times. They didn't know that humanity's military had a saying, "You can take the soldier out of the war, but some soldiers carry the war inside them forever." Marcus turned away from the escape tunnel. He moved back through the access passage, but his movements had changed. No longer the shuffle of a maintenance worker, but the purposeful glide of someone who had spent years learning to move through hostile territory. He reached his quarters in 90 seconds, bypassing the door lock with a trick that definitely wasn't in any janitor's handbook. The room looked modest to casual inspection. But Marcus went to the false panel in the floor, the one hidden beneath his bed. Inside was a container, magnetically sealed, temperature-controlled, and very, very illegal to possess on an educational station. He opened it. The weapons inside were human-made, which meant they looked primitive to most galactic species, but were actually evolutionary products of thousands of years of humans perfecting the art of killing each other. A compact rifle that used chemical propellants rather than energy cells, reliable in any condition and utterly silent when fitted with its suppressor. 2 handguns, similarly archaic and similarly effective. Knives, because Marcus had learned that sometimes the oldest tools were still the best. And something else. A small device that looked like a simple cylinder, but was actually a piece of military hardware that could make a very bad day much worse for anyone unlucky enough to be on the wrong end of it. Marcus loaded the weapons with the ease of someone performing a familiar ritual. He stripped off his maintenance jumpsuit, revealing the tactical undersuit he'd never actually stopped wearing, even here. He secured the gear, checked the loads, and performed the mental calculations that would determine the next hour. Numbers of enemies, probable positions, structural weak points, collateral concerns. Zilara was in that building. So were 147 other children. The Caltherians had brought approximately 200 soldiers. The math was bad, but Marcus had worked with bad math before. He moved. The first Caltherian patrol encountered something they had no frame of reference for. One moment they were securing a corridor, following standard doctrine, confident in their superiority. The next moment, 3 of them were dead before the sound of the shots even registered. The fourth turned, trying to locate the threat, and found a human standing 15 meters away with a weapon that looked almost toy-like pointed directly at his face. "Sleep tight," Marcus said, and fired. The human disappeared back into the ventilation system before backup arrived. The Caltherians found their dead and immediately upgraded their threat assessment. They began moving in larger groups, covering corners, taking the attack seriously. But they were hunting something they didn't understand. Humans didn't have scales like Caltherians. They didn't have natural armor or redundant organs. They were, by most galactic standards, absurdly fragile. But humans had spent hundreds of thousands of years as persistence hunters on a death world, and they'd developed certain traits that served them well. They could think tactically while under extreme stress. They could suppress pain and fear when necessary. They could make decisions in milliseconds that other species needed minutes to process. And some humans, the ones who'd gone to war and learned to excel at it, became something that terrified their own kind, let alone aliens who'd never encountered it. Marcus moved through the academy like a ghost. He used the infrastructure itself as a weapon, cutting power to sections to create darkness, venting atmosphere in sealed corridors, using his knowledge of every duct and passage to appear and vanish seemingly at will. Each engagement lasted seconds. Each time, more Caltherians died. On the bridge of his flagship, Veshkan watched his tactical display with growing confusion, turning to alarm. Signals were going dark. Squads were failing to report. And when they did make contact with whatever was hunting them, the descriptions made no sense. "A single human?" he demanded. "One maintenance worker is doing this?" His tactical officer hesitated. "Commander, I think we should reconsider our assessment of human combat capabilities." Veshkan's mandibles clacked in anger. He'd studied humans. They were diplomats, traitors, cultural opportunists. They'd joined the galactic community with smiles and handshakes. They had no major military presence, no territorial ambitions. They were harmless, except one of them was currently carving through his soldiers like a scythe through grass. "Send a full platoon to secure the children," Veshkan ordered. "Use them as leverage. Find this human and make him watch while we execute them one by one until he surrenders." It was, tactically, the correct decision. It was also the worst mistake Veshkan would ever make. Marcus intercepted the communication. He'd spliced into their network 20 minutes ago, another trick that janitors definitely didn't learn in training. He heard the order. He checked his remaining ammunition. Not enough for a frontal assault. But then, Marcus had never been much for frontal assaults. He reached the central plaza where the children were being held and assessed the situation from a high vantage point. 47 Caltherians surrounding 147 children. Hostage situation, elevated risk to civilians, multiple armed opponents. The kind of scenario that military academies used as an example of unwinnable situations. Marcus had been in 3 of those before. He'd won 2. He activated the device he'd brought from his quarters, set its timer, and threw it into the plaza's power junction. Then he moved to position, weapon ready, and waited. The explosion wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. It knocked out every light in the plaza, every tactical display, every communication relay. Suddenly, the Caltherians were blind, and their hostages were screaming. Marcus dropped into the plaza and went to work. What happened next would be analyzed by military historians for years. How a single human, armed with primitive weapons and nothing but knowledge of the terrain, managed to eliminate 47 trained soldiers while protecting nearly 150 children. The after-action reconstruction would show tactical decisions made in fractions of seconds, use of environment that bordered on precognitive, and a level of controlled violence that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. But in the moment, to Zilara huddled with the other children in the darkness, it was simpler. She heard weapon fire, screams, the sound of Marcus's voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay down! Cover your ears! Don't look up!" She did as he said. They all did. And when emergency lighting finally kicked on 7 minutes later, the Caltherians were gone, and Marcus stood in the center of the plaza covered in blood that wasn't his, breathing hard but standing steady. "It's okay now," he said, his voice returning to something gentler. "You're safe." Zilara stared at him. So did all the other children. They'd seen what he could do. They'd heard the sounds of what happened when something threatened them, and they understood, perhaps better than any adult, that the friendly janitor who told stories was also something much more dangerous. Veshkan, watching from his flagship, made his final mistake. Enraged by the loss of his ground forces, he ordered an orbital bombardment of the plaza itself. If he couldn't have the hostages, he'd at least kill the human who'd caused this disaster. Marcus saw the weapons charging on the ships above. He looked at the children around him, at Zilara's wide, terrified eyes, and made his decision. He activated his communication device, broadcasting on all frequencies, and spoke in perfect galactic common. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Webb, formerly of the 3rd Human Expeditionary Force. I am currently protecting 147 civilian children on an educational station. Any ship that fires on this position will be considered an act of war against Earth and humanity. Choose very carefully what happens next." Veshkan hesitated. Earth was new to galactic politics, yes, but they had begun establishing trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and mutual defense discussions with several major powers. An act of war against Earth might bring complications. Then again, what could one primitive world do? He ordered the bombardment. The weapons never fired. Before Veshkan could even process what was happening, his flagship lurched violently. Alarms screamed across every deck. His tactical officer shouted something about multiple breaches, about ships decloaking, about weapons fire. 3 human vessels had arrived, having been conducting training exercises 2 systems away when they received Marcus's transmission. They weren't warships by galactic standards, just patrol frigates, small and agile. But they'd been designed by a species that had been fighting itself for millennia and had gotten very, very good at it. The Caltherian fleet was more powerful, but it had been positioned for bombardment, not combat. And the human ships moved with a coordination that suggested not just training, but actual combat experience, real battles fought and won. Within 18 minutes, 2 Caltherian vessels were crippled, 3 more were retreating, and Veshkan's flagship was surrounded. "Stand down or be destroyed," came the transmission from the lead human vessel. The voice was professional, almost bored, the tone of someone making a routine statement. "You have 30 seconds to comply." Veshkan stood down. The aftermath was complicated. Galactic authorities arrived, investigations were conducted, and diplomatic channels exploded with activity. The Caltherian Empire claimed they'd been acting on intelligence about weapons smuggling. Earth presented evidence of an unprovoked attack on civilians. Other species, seeing the recordings of what had happened, found themselves reassessing their understanding of humanity. Marcus was questioned extensively. His military record was examined. Questions were raised about why someone with his capabilities had been working as a janitor. He answered honestly, he'd wanted peace. He'd wanted to be away from war. He'd thought he could be something other than a soldier. But Zilara had screamed his name, and everything he'd tried to leave behind had come roaring back. The investigation concluded that Marcus had acted in defense of civilian lives, using appropriate force given the circumstances. No charges were filed. He was commended for his actions and offered a position in Earth's diplomatic security force at a substantial salary increase. He turned it down. Instead, he requested to return to Dawn's Edge Academy, once it was repaired, to continue working as maintenance staff. When asked why, he simply said that someone needed to keep the ventilation systems running, and he'd made friends there he didn't want to leave. The galactic community drew many conclusions from the incident. Military strategists revised their assessments of human combat capabilities upward considerably. Diplomatic corps began treating human representatives with notably more respect, and parents across a dozen worlds made note of which species had sent military forces to protect their children when they were in danger. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people viewed humanity itself. They'd seemed so friendly, so eager to fit in, so harmless. Now everyone understood that there was something else beneath that friendly surface. Something that could be kind and gentle right up until the moment you threatened what they cared about. Something that wouldn't stop, wouldn't quit, wouldn't surrender even when logic said they should. The humans called it many things: protectiveness, stubbornness, the warrior spirit. But across the galaxy, another term began to circulate. A phrase that captured something essential about this strange species that could be both janitor and soldier, both friend and nightmare, depending on what the situation required. They called it the human factor. And they made very sure never to trigger it again. Marcus returned to his maintenance duties. He mopped floors, repaired ventilation systems, and checked on the children to make sure they were settling back in after the trauma. Zilara still visited him during lunch, though now she brought friends. Other children wanted to hear his stories, wanted to show him their schoolwork, wanted to be near the strange human who'd proved that sometimes the person who seems most ordinary is anything but. He was content with that. He'd never wanted to be special. He'd just wanted to do his job and be left alone. But he'd learned something important during the attack. You can try to leave the warrior behind, but when children cry out for help, some people simply cannot ignore it. So Marcus Webb, call sign Badger, continued his quiet life at Dawn's Edge Academy, and every species in the galaxy made very certain that if they ever had business near that station, they treated everyone there with the utmost respect, because you never knew when the janitor might be something more. And humanity had made it abundantly clear. Mess with their kids, and you'd find out exactly what they were capable of. That was the lesson the Caltherians learned. That was the lesson the galaxy remembered. And that was why, for years afterward, Dawn's Edge Academy remained one of the safest places in known space, because the honey badger was watching. And honey badgers never ever quit.